One of the largest amusement parks in the US, having its own island and road, considering itself the roller coaster capital of the world, and mentioned earlier on this very show, this is the story of Cedar Point. Some people may ask why I'd do one on Cedar Point after I've already done Cedar Fair. Well, that's because the park itself has a long, interesting history. While it's tied to Cedar Fair, it wasn't covered in much detail at all once Valley Fair was acquired. So, without further ado, let's travel to the park's beginning in 1870 and even before that. Before the park even existed, Lake Erie was a rather famous vacation spot amongst the middle class. Many of the lake's islands would become popular for their freshwater bathing resorts. As for the then peninsula that now hosts the park, it was named Cedar Point after the numerous amount of cedar trees, and was a popular fishing destination. Many of the fishermen would even lease land on the peninsula and build houses for themselves. The closest town was Sandusky, which would become a fairly major economic center in the following years, thanks to its large harbor and rail connections. And thanks to those connections, the area as a whole began to grow. The tip of the peninsula would become housing for ammunition during the Civil War. The ammunition was partially used for defense of a prison for POWs on Johnson's Island nearby. Some of the boats used to transport prisoners to the island were built by a German immigrant, Louis Zistel. He would later use the boats to ferry locals to the peninsula in 1870. This was very successful thanks to its resurgence as a summer destination for picnics. Zistel would later open a bathhouse and beer garden with a dance floor. The boat he used to ferry locals is called the Young Reindeer and could ferry people from Sandusky to Cedar Point for 25 cents. This was the beginning of real commercial tourism on the peninsula. From 1888 to 1891, many attractions would be built on the peninsula, including more bathhouses, a dance hall, steamboats would ferry passengers to Miller's Cove and Cedar Point Light, picnic tables, a baseball diamond, a pavilion with a concert hall and bowling alley, which still exists today, and the first thrill ride on the peninsula, a water toboggan ride that would launch riders into the lake. But the first roller coaster would be installed in 1892, the Switchback Railway. Standing at a towering 25 feet high and reaching a maximum speed of 10 miles per hour, the coaster had two identical tracks, one for coasting down the route and another for allowing someone to push the train back up. The real start of the peninsula becoming what it is today was in 1897 when the Lake Erie and Western Railroad bought the peninsula for the equivalent of $7.7 million and formed the Cedar Point Pleasure Resort Company. The park would be managed by George A. Boekling. It was this purchase and leadership that turned Cedar Point from a picnic ground into what it is today. A second roller coaster was built on the peninsula in 1902, Figure 8 Roller Toboggan. Several years later, it would be moved and renamed the Racer. Near the beach, a pony truck was built the same year. By 1904, mosquitoes had become such a problem that the park hired the Detroit Dredging Company to come in and drain out swampy areas in the peninsula. Detroit Dredging had connected a series of lagoons to form a water passageway, which quickly became a signature attraction, due to Boekling believing that if guests stayed longer at the resort, the more profitable it would be, as well as overwhelming demand causing problems with the current hotels. In 1905, one of the largest hotels in the Midwest would open, the 600-room Hotel Breakers. Built during the golden age of U.S. resorts, the resort features a rotunda in the center with 8 three-story wings coming out of it. The resort featured ornate landscaping and beautiful flower gardens. In 1987, the hotel was designated as a National Historic Landmark. However, in 2001, that designation would be withdrawn due to too many changes being made to the building, including building material changes, windows replaced with foul balconies, and more. Though the rotunda has retained much of the same aspects, the design language of the rotunda and wings, some of which have been removed, added, and generally altered, was ruined by the addition of a 10-story building within the complex. The hotel is an iconic one for the reason that some notable guests have been John D. Rockefeller, Theodore Roosevelt, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and a few more. The park would also add a new area in 1906 called Amusement Circle. It was designed to link the pier to the beach and was located southeast of the Coliseum, which was a large arena built the same year that included a ballroom and other attractions. Over time, the Coliseum would house restaurants, beer gardens, and even a skating rink. Since the 1960s, the building has also housed one of the largest collection of pinball, video, and arcade games in any amusement park in the world. 1908 saw the addition of Dip the Dip's Scenic Railway, though was quickly overshadowed in 1912 by the addition of the far superior Leap the Dips ride. And to make matters worse for our dear old Leap the Dips, in 1917 the coaster was removed and replaced with the Leapfrog Scenic Railway. Though, with all these additions and changes within such a short period, the park really started to gain traction as an amusement park, with more attractions being added and a wider variety of them as well. Though this would not yet become the focus, as Boekling did not see it as a priority, instead marking the point as a bathing resort, filled with films, exhibits, shows, and more, with little emphasis being put onto the rides. In the remaining tenure of Boekling, many more hotels were added, these including Hotel Cedars, White House Hotel, Crystal Rock Castle, and Crystal Gardens Ballroom, allowing for more capacity in the park as well as attracting more visitors. In 1926, the Cyclone, a rough wooden roller coaster, though more advanced than the Leap the Dips ride and Leapfrogs of previous years, was added. As time went on, many attractions were replaced or updated, including the removal of the Racer, Circle Swings, and a few more for the addition of a simple Shoot the Chutes ride, a Tilt-A-Whirl, and fun houses. This expansion, along with the other offerings and numerous hotels, made the park even more attractive and successful. Though in the late 1920s, Boekling's health began to decline, with him becoming confined to a wheelchair in 1931, requiring assistance from an employee or relative to oversee the park, which his declining health did not stop him from doing. Though he eventually had to stay indoors, and on July 24, 1931, George A. Boekling would pass away from uremia. His portrait in the Hotel Breakers lobby was covered in a black tarp, and every flag in the resort and on the G.A. Boekling were lowered to half-mast. After Boekling's passing, Eric Smith took over as management, and a little expansion of the area happened in the 1930s. One of the only rides that was added was the Tumblebug, a ride where visitors spun around a central axle on a circular track which varied in height. The mid-1930s saw the removal of the now decaying Leap the Dips ride. The resort was even on the brink of sale to the Ohio government for $3 million, the equivalent of $52 million today. Though in 1938, the upper floor of the Coliseum was updated in the Art Deco style and a new stage, with the original dance floor remaining in the center. With many of the most popular bands at the time playing there, it kept the park operational through the Depression. Though this did not stop the need for financial help by the end of World War II, with the Cyclone sitting, rotting away, and the boardwalk being damaged and cracked in many locations, as well as repairs being needed on the fishing dock. They installed the Midway Carousel in 1946, which is the oldest still operating ride at the park, and the Cyclone was demolished in 1951 due to its declining condition, leaving the park without a roller coaster. Though more attractions were installed while demolition went along, including Laugh in the Dark, Loop-A-Plane, and rocket ships. The Cedar Point Causeway was built in 1957, which also still stands today. In 1958, the president of Cedar Point, Bernie Zeiher, was replaced by George Roos, and Emily Legros was also elected chairman that year. In 1954, new admission stalls were installed and the hotels were repainted. On top of this, over the equivalent of $10 million was spent to refresh the park and fix any damages and decay. This also installed the park's first coaster since Cyclone, Wild Mouse. And in 1959, the resort also gained a monorail, which quickly became the most popular attraction there. Hotel Breakers was repainted, and the surrounding neglected buildings were demolished. The Coliseum and Grand Pavilion were also remodeled. The Crystal Rock Castle maintenance shop, some boathouses, and the old powerhouse were demolished, and a new boathouse, boiler house, and maintenance shop took their place. It was in the 1960s when the idea of single-price season passes became popular. These had to do with their short-lived but announced plans of turning the park into a Disneyland amusement center. Whatever they meant by that, I can't say. Though in 1964, they built another new roller coaster, Blue Streak. The name comes from the local high school football team, the Sandusky Blue Streaks. Good news is, in 1969, the Cedar Point and Lake Erie Railroad opened, taking visitors from the center of the park to the back. Also in 1969, the park built its second oldest roller coaster, the Cedar Creek Mine Ride. In 1970, in honor of the 100th anniversary of the park, the Centennial Theater was opened. The theater was later named the Jack Aldrich Theater. In 1972, the park built Jumbo Jet, a still operating coaster, albeit in Belarus, that was the fastest in the world at the time. Robert L. Munger Jr. took over as Cedar Point's president after Roos retired. The park would then create the Corkscrew, the first roller coaster to ever span a midway, as well as the first to have 3 inversions. They also beat their own record in 1978 when Gemini opened, billed as the tallest, fastest, and steepest roller coaster in the world. In 1985, Avalanche Run, a bobsled coaster, would open close to the beach. However, due to the sands and winds of the area, the ride was taken indoors and renamed Disaster Transport. The building it was housed in did make the sand less of a problem, though rain would still be able to get into the building. In 1986, Munger would step down as CEO of Cedar Fair and be replaced with Robert Dick Kinzel. 2 years later, in 1988, Soak City, now Cedar Point Shores, opened near Hotel Breakers. The water park featured speed slides, over 10 body and tube slides, a family raft ride, as well as 2 lazy rivers. Between 1989 and 2011, several record-breaking roller coasters would open at Cedar Point. The first was Magnum XL 200, which was the first roller coaster to reach 200 feet and had a speed over 70 miles an hour, which makes it the world's first hypercoaster. Mean Streak opened in 1991, being the northernmost attraction in the park. It was also the tallest and fastest Woody in the world, being 161 feet tall and going over 65 miles an hour. Snake River Falls opened as a result of the popularity of Soak City in 1993, dropping riders 82 feet at 40 miles an hour. It was the tallest and fastest water ride in the world. In 1994, the Mill Race Log Ride was removed in favor of Raptor, the first inverted roller coaster to have a cobra roll. In 1996, Mantos opened as the tallest, steepest, and fastest stand-up roller coaster in the world. The coaster's original name was the unpopular Banshee, though due to public opinion the name was changed. Though Cedar Fair would be able to use the name again in Kings Island in 2014. The world's first Giga Coaster also opened at Cedar Point, Millennium Force, in 2000. It was the tallest and fastest coaster to complete a full circuit at the time. The other record holder was Superman, The Escape at Six Flags Magic Mountain. Millennium Force reached a maximum height of 310 feet and a maximum speed of 93 miles an hour. Superman, on the other hand, soared 215 feet and went a maximum of 100 miles an hour. In 2002, the park would open Wicked Twister, which held the specific record of being the tallest, fastest, and longest impulse coaster of its kind. But they were running behind the competition. Other parks were also making great coasters that were competing with Cedar Point. So, in 2003, they opened a Top Thrill Dragster, which was the tallest and fastest coaster in the world overall, beating Superman by reaching 420 feet and 120 miles an hour. In 2 years, Six Flags would take back both of those records with King Cod Great Adventure, one of which it keeps to this day. Dan Keller would retire in 2005, leaving the positions of Vice President and General Manager to John Hildebrandt, the former of these two titles at Dorney Park and Wildwater Kingdom since 2004. They would break another record, this time with a flat ride, opening a Skyhawk next to Snake River Falls. It is still the tallest Screamin' Swing in the world. In 2008, the park opened Planet Snoopy, a kids area that I mentioned because a lot of its rides were taken from Geauga Lake. In 2012, Dick Kinzel would retire, leaving the position to Matt Ouimet, a former president of the Disney Cruise Line and Disneyland Resort, as well as associated jobs within Walt Disney Imagineering, Disney's Wide World of Sports, and Disney Vacation Club. He had been with Disney for 17 years beforehand. Also, in 2012, the park would receive the popular Fast Lane system that had been introduced at Kings Island in 2011. In 2012, the park removed Wildcat, being replaced by Luminosity Ignite the Night. In 2012, the park also removed Disaster Transport and Space Spiral in favor of a Gatekeeper, the longest winged roller coaster in the world, which would open in 2013. Along with it, a new Entra Plaza was constructed, replacing the original one that had been there since the 60s, and now has 2 support columns that the coaster navigates through. At the end of 2013, John Hildebrandt would retire as the general manager and was replaced by Jason McClure, who is also a former VP and general manager at Dorney Park. 2016 saw the addition of Valaravan, the tallest, fastest, and longest dive coaster in the world. The ride replaced the Good Time Theater as well as Turnpike Cars, an antique cars ride. And finally, in 2016, the popular wooden coaster Mean Streak would close, and until 2017, guests assumed the coaster would be torn down. However, in 2017, the park announced that the coaster was going to be refurbished by Rocky Mountain Construction as Steel Vengeance, opening in 2018.